And good morning, Hoosier Nation, and welcome to another edition of Hoosier Morning After. This is Hoosier Morning After an amazing offseason. This morning, we are going to look back at all the major events that happened in the offseason. And after a lot of tough post-game shows here on Hoosier Morning After, a look back at some mostly positives is kind of a really nice show to have. And believe it or not, with the basketball season closer than you think, we're just under a month away from the first tip. You may notice that the show looks a little bit different and that I'm not alone. This is a bit of a test show, bringing others in so that during the season you don't have to just listen to me ramble on. I've got a few people that I'll be bringing in from time to time for post-game shows, so at the expense of not rambling anymore, let's get into our guests who we have. So for the first guest, I have to admit, I tried to get Mark Cuban on. I emailed him asking to come on, and I actually got a reply. He said, "All my attention is on the Mavs. I root hard for IU, but don't know anything about the class at all." Well, since I didn't get that guy who's attached to the media center, I got this guy who's attached to the media center, Galen Clavio. You guys might know him from all of his stuff with Crimson Cast, or his barbecue how-tos, or even his rants about tailgating chips decorum. Galen, thanks for coming on. How you doing? Just before we get into the past, I want to just kind of get your temperature on how you're feeling about the Hoosier basketball team right now.
Hi, thanks for having me. Great to be here. I feel okay right now. It's nice. I will say I'm not as juiced as everybody else is, but it's not because I don't think that the team could be good. I need to see something first to get really fired up, and I think that may be a healthy place for everybody to be emotionally right now, at least for me. But I think it's been a good offseason overall, and I'm excited to see what this team does on the floor this year.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting to see, and I'm where you are. I'm trying to stave back, and there's been a lot of talk recently. A lot of people expectations. You need to kind of change that with optimism. I think that's kind of where I stand. Don't expect things. Just be optimistic. Change those words in your mind. Change those emotions. Shift those around and everything. For me, it was extra hard being in the Bahamas and everything, and we'll kind of delve into talking about that. But so going back, obviously the very first kind of timestamp thing where we would bring this back to is the very final game. That happened on March 11th of 2021. IU lost to Rutgers 61-50. The game was played up in Indy. There were boos, there were chants for Fire Archie, everything like that. Obviously, we didn't get fans in there much at all during games, and then this was kind of the first time the fans were in there. Just what were your reactions to that, the end of the season, and then how fans were reacting to that? Where were you in that space and time?
Well, it wasn't just the last game. It was the fact that the last game was the last of a 6-game losing streak to close the season. And I just honestly kind of felt like I was in the same spot that I'd been in the previous few seasons. And really, being honest, like even going back further than that, yeah, not every season was ending in losing streaks like that, but it just kind of felt like, gosh, here we are again, and IU is clearly a tier below even the marginal teams that are making into the NCAA tournament. It wasn't just that you lost to Rutgers, it was that, you lost to Rutgers and Rutgers went on and got a 10 seed and won a game in the NCAA tournament. And the feeling from my perspective was this is really feeling like a dead end at this place as far as this program is concerned. And I was, the boos that occurred, I don't get too wound up about things that crowds do. Crowds do strange things, things that maybe we would regret as individuals, but there's a kind of a power of collective action. It's like there was something happened in one of the college football games yesterday where Penn State players kept getting injured and Iowa fans kept getting angry because it was stopping the flow of the offense. And, I kind of felt the same then as I did with IU fans booing Archie. That was the first time that IU fans had really had a chance to see that team in person at all. And it's still a passionate fan base. It's still a fan base that has expectations. And, you never like to see your coach getting booed on a national stage like that. But I think the level of frustration was just so palpable with this fan base at that time period that I wasn't surprised that it happened. And so I didn't think it was going to lead to anything. And I certainly thought, well, here we are, and this is just how it is. But this was a weird year. It was a pandemic year. You had a shortened schedule. It was a rough set of circumstances for everybody involved. Certainly I just thought, well, this is going to look ugly coming out of the season, but there'll be a long off season. Everybody will forget about it, and we'll start fresh the next year. And we really did, but it was in a different way than I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I was always kind of towing that line. I was always arguing with myself, honestly. I'd sit there and go, gosh, we got to get rid of Archie. Well, but we had a lot of games that were so close. That was just one thing. We were right on the edge. Well, he hasn't been in a tournament. Well, we were right on the edge. We could have been, but then we got in a slump, and this person got injured, or that happened, and we need to get rid of him. Well, it's a pandemic year, and athletics are down, and that $10 million, that's a lot to raise and get going. And I was concerned with how that would happen and how that would affect not only basketball, just IU athletics as a whole, because we are really kind of getting into a golden era of just IU athletics, period. And while, yes, basketball is the marquee, I don't want to get too caught up on controlling that at the expense of others and everything.
Yeah, I mean, the firing, the whole idea of, does Archie stay or go? A lot of it to me came down to this idea of, okay, there's a contract in place. It's a pretty sizable buyout. So from a financial perspective, the athletic department probably lost $20 million during the pandemic, and that might be conservative. And, a lot of cost-cutting efforts to try to keep from doing what many other schools did, where they were cutting sports. And I figured, all things considered, IU athletics is going to look at this and say, look, financially this doesn't make sense. Not just on not just the fact that it was a lot of money, but especially in that context, and especially given that it was a pandemic year. And I think in both college football and college basketball, a lot of people went into last season thinking, well, every coach has a get out of jail free card this year for whatever happens with their programs. And gosh, that just didn't happen at all. I mean, athletic departments and athletic directors basically looked at results as if it was a regular non-pandemic season. And so, I don't think Archie gets fired if he doesn't have that 6-game losing streak to close the season. I mean, it's certainly possible that it could have still happened, but it would have been hard to fire a guy who made the tournament. And really, I think all it was going to take was another couple of wins, and they might have been in the tournament. So that, from that perspective, the way that everything went down surprised me. I wasn't disappointed. I think I was one of the last holdouts on the Archie era. I thought that he had enough internal ability as a head coach that it was, going to be hard to just say, look, this obviously isn't working with the guy. And, they were like you mentioned, they were just good enough that they were almost in the tournament for a couple of different occasions there. But hey, look, IU with a level of decisiveness that we don't normally see out of them, I think historically, when it comes to firing coaches, it always felt like they kind of would wait a year too long to do those sorts of things. So that's why I was surprised that it ended up happening this time.
Yeah. Well, and then speaking with the money, then Scott Dolson obviously surprises us and says that he raised the $10 million to buy out his contract. 2 donors. Galen, if you want to go ahead and out yourself here on this podcast, you can say that you were one of the donors. That's fine. We'll let that announcement fly on this. But
you're doing great, let me tell you. So
thank you for that, Galen. But he in that announces that he's not going to use a search committee. He's going to do it himself. Dolson wants someone both that embraces IU's tradition, but also has a vision for the future and a playing style that's attractive to recruits. So that's something. Obviously, Scott Dolson was very in touch with the fan base and was listening to what everyone was saying, because he comes out and says that press conference, and he just gives Hoosier Nation traditionalists and futurists a big hug, and just everyone gets excited from that kind of speech. And no search committee. Obviously, you can take that either way. but just says that he's getting to work, and the next time you see him, he's going to have a coach for you. I know that's when Crimson Cast kicked into gear, and you became a very, very, very busy man. But how shocked were you when Scott came out and said he found that money, and that the firing happened on March 15th, that quickly, even 4 days after that final game? What was your reaction to all that just kind of coming in?
Well, I was a little surprised about them finding the money, just because, again, pandemic and just the economic situation in general didn't seem like they'd be able to externally raise that level of funding. Not because it wasn't just the money to buy Archie out; it was also going to be the money to pay the next coach. So it's a pretty significant chunk of change. The timing of everything, I was a little bit surprised by. I figured if they were going to make a change, it was going to be relatively early in the proceedings, maybe a day or two after the season ended, not 4 days after the season ended. But the fact that they made the change, I think a lot of it was less about finding the money, because I think that was likely there already, and I think more of it was about, all right, what direction are we going to go with this, and do we feel like we have a good chance with whoever our top candidates are? And look, if you've got both of those things, if you've got the finances and you've got the direction that you want to go, then why not at that point? As far as what my thought process was in terms of, hey, they actually fired Archie, it was more just like, wow, all right, this is a different IU than we'd gotten used to in the previous decade. And that's not a criticism of Fred Glass. I think that Fred Glass just tended to work in a slightly different way. But I think Scott Dolson, being a new athletic director and just being a guy that's been around IU sports and IU basketball in particular now for almost 40 years, he's a guy that had his own conceptualization of what he wanted in the coach and what he wanted with the program. And I think you're better off as an athletic director if you have the money at your disposal to make the changes you think are necessary to send the program going in your direction. Because the longer you wait, the more you end up with a situation where somebody else's mess becomes your mess. And so from that perspective, it did make a lot of sense as long as the money was there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I liked his vibrato that he had. I liked his excitement, and his dedication to the program was evident. And it was just kind of, then here we go. What are we going to do? Who are we going to find? And it's a tinge of excitement at the beginning. Obviously, you hear different rumors about who IU's looking at. The rumor mill began. I've got a source. He's got a source. So I really kind of think, looking back now, when we discussed who the next coach was going to be, it kind of falls in kind of four categories. And one would be kind of the up-and-coming coaches, kind of what Archie's hire kind of was. You got Chris Beard, Porter Moser, Eric Musselman, Mark Few, those kind of things that came around. Then you had ex-players. People always bring up Steve Alford. You always get that. Mike Lewis, that was one that I was kind of on the train for, to be honest. Calbert, Dane Fife, Woodson was even in the discussion there. Then you had the veterans, Thad Matta, John Beeline, Rick Pitino. Those you kind of get questioned about their age and stuff, which is interesting because we kind of married two of them. And then you had the chosen one. We had Brad Stevens, and we got towed around quite a bit on that one. Our emotions up and down. Did we think he was going to be the one? There's rumors that he's doing this. There's rumors that he's doing that. And he actually had to let us down twice in comments, which was pretty crazy and shows how desperate we were for that. I know you did a lot of podcasting during that, talking to different people. Where, looking back and thinking back to that time, where was your headspace with those different candidates, and was maybe your top three, or who did you think were really the options at that point?
I mean, and it's always funny looking back in retrospect, because I'm not sure that any of my thoughts were necessarily good ones at that stage in terms of like what direction they might go. I assumed they were going to take a run at Brad Stevens. I didn't know how realistic that was going to be. And then I really wanted Thad Matta as the head coach if he was physically capable of doing it. I thought that was all the different factors involved, whether it was success in the Big Ten, success overall as a coach, age, if he was physically capable of handling the job, which I think he probably was not, that would have been the slam dunk hire. And I was confused. Like there were people that were arguing that wouldn't have been a good hire. And I'm like, you're nuts if that's your thought process, certainly compared to some of the other people that were out there. And I think that for most of the hot candidates that were in people's minds, I think there were elements about them that were unattractive, from IU's perspective. And, whether that was, questions of recruiting tactics with people like Beard or Musselman or there was with any of these coaching searches, there's a lot of other factors besides the actual coaching that goes into them. As much as IU has become a place where you need to have a good culture, around you, on a particular type of culture in particular, there were some people that were in that mix that, from what I was hearing behind the scenes, probably weren't going to be good matches. I didn't think they were going to go the direction of Woodson, but I wasn't surprised when they did, because he did, when you rattled off what Scott Dolson said he was looking for, you think back on it, it's like, well, gosh, that actually, he does check all of those boxes. But I think the big issue that I ran into, and I think anybody that was following the search, is it's impossible not to let the commentary and the thought process of media commentators affect the way that you're thinking of the search and who should or should not be included. And the IU fans, I think, got rightfully irritated at a lot of national media types, but the national media types are generally looking at this from the standpoint of, here's the accepted list of candidates or the accepted list of figures for a job in major college basketball. When you go outside of that orthodoxy, people have a tendency to be very critical, not just because it doesn't match the list that they had, but it also tends to kind of upset the apple cart in the way that we think about college basketball. I mean, same thing happened when like Juwan Howard got hired at Michigan a few years ago, where a guy's just not on the radar, and that's hard for people who cover the sport regularly to really get their heads wrapped around. So, I thought Mata would have been a great choice. And beyond that, I trusted Scott Dolson to have an idea of what he wanted for IU basketball. And I don't think I would have given that same level of trust to any of our prior athletic directors. But again, given how long Dolson's been around and how much I know that he knows about the culture of Indiana basketball, I was fairly confident that we were going to end up with somebody that was going to work out long term. I wasn't worried that he was going to go in like a completely different direction from everybody else and pull somebody in that wasn't going to be acceptable for the job.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely an emotional roller coaster. You got excited about some things, you got excited about not, and then infuriating too. I mean, we felt all emotions during that time, and like you said, with the national media speaking up and really kind of bashing our fan base, bashing us as fans, and saying that we're toxic, saying that no one's going to want that job and everything. Honestly, doubt started to creep in. A little bit, and I saw on Twitter and stuff like that, and myself as well. I go, oh well, maybe we won't get someone that's going to be good. Are we gonna doom to take a chance again, like we did with Archie and everything? And then as quickly as, even though it was quick when we finally got the announcement, even though it didn't feel like it was just 13 days after Archie was fired. That's quick. But that time felt like it was a long time. March 28th, Woodson is announced. And for me, myself, I was actually driving in the car on the way to a job that was about 3 hours away. And I get there and I open up my phone and Twitter's just exploded. And I'm immediately trying to delve in and figure out everything and Mike Woodson, and I'm dealing with those emotions and the different announcements that come along with it. how did you find out? When did you find out? And then what was your initial reaction? What was your gut initial reaction before you kind of had a chance to step back to it?
Part of the problem with the pandemic is all the days have run together to the point that I don't even remember where I was when I heard the news. I'm almost certain I was, because I think the news started to break on like a Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, or sometime over the weekend where we started to see the name float around. And look, I'll be honest, I heard the name and at first I thought it was a bad rumor. Not that it was a terrible rumor, but that the information was bad, because I hadn't heard a whole lot about things going in that direction. But then it became pretty apparent pretty quickly, and then IU came out with something relatively quickly that said, yes, this is the person that we're going to hire. And I was pretty underwhelmed at first, just from the standpoint of I was surprised that they were going to go that direction. And I think that, just being perfectly honest, and this is something that I think a lot of people that were following IU or covering IU media-wise, their interpretation was, wow, IU must have struck out on like 4 or 5 of its top choices if they had to settle for hiring Mike Woodson. And, that was in part just because, Woodson was talked about the last time the job was open and didn't get the job. And, I think, again, I go back to what I said earlier about the frame within which we evaluate the IU coaching search and who's a candidate had really been set. And it was that group of names that you listed at the beginning. It's like, well, are they going to pull in Nate Oates, or are they going to pull in, Chris Beard or somebody like that? And when it's not one of those names that's already in the college game, I think you're naturally going to say, gosh, what happened? Like, how did they end up down there? But I think, as it turns out, talking with people after the fact, this was option number 2. And this was actually who they targeted and who they had been cultivating. And once I heard that, I felt better about it. And then, obviously, as we got into the early stages of the Woodson era, there's some good feelings that pop up. Great first press conference, and that first month or so when we find out all these players are going to be coming back and playing. That was, I think, a key element to soften, not just soften the blow, but make it feel like, okay, this was the direction that IU wanted to go, and we're actually in a good spot here. But it did take a while for me to get to that point.
Yeah. I think I had that gut reaction as well. I mean, I think you start to go, okay, who else did we try? What got us here? And then I'll admit I had the argument that that Coach Woodson's still having to deal with. I had that, he's an NBA guy. How's that going to translate to the college game and everything? And actually, that leads to another announcement that was pretty quiet on that same day, and everything was the announcement of Thad Matta being added in as associate athletic director for basketball. So that quickly made me excited. Honestly, when I saw that Thad thing, I was like, okay, that's the perfect marriage. As you said, he was your number one choice if his health was in a good place. And here he has a position that he can be involved in college basketball and allow his health, be mindful of his health, I should say, and just be an advisor in that sense. And so thinking of those two, like a two-headed beast was created that day, honestly, for IU basketball. How did you react as well to then hearing Thad was going to be added with him?
I mean, I was really intrigued by that. Now, I've kind of, it's funny, as much attention as initially got paid to that by me and by others, I don't think I quite interpreted what that hire meant. And to some degree, much like you, I heard the news and I was like, okay, well, here's someone that can help guide the ship while someone learns the ropes of being a college coach. And I still believe that to some degree, but I also think that Mata being involved highlighted a greater ambition for IU basketball on the part of Scott Dolson. And we'll see how it works, but I think it's a really ingenious approach, which is this idea of, IU basketball needs to stop just being treated like a door in the hallway of IU sports, and instead it almost needs an administrative structure around it. The business has changed, especially with what we've seen with name, image, and likeness and all of these other things going on with the changing model of college athletics, to have people in almost executive roles helping out with the administrative duties and the other things behind the scenes, and maybe even a little bit of actual coaching with one of the recent NCAA rules. That was smart. And, I think that a lot of what we interpreted with the Mata news early, people thought he was being considered for coach. I think this was ultimately what his interest was. It's like, how do I get involved in the game, but in a way where I'm not the lead person? I can just assist with something. I can do something behind the scenes. And so, as this whole thing has fleshed out, I think that as I go back and look at the sequence of events that happened in March and early April, I say to myself, well, okay, there was definitely a plan of action here. And there was something that Scott Dolson had a vision for, and the rest of the athletic department had a vision for. And I don't think anybody knows how it's going to work, but they certainly got the right people, people with a lot of experience, people with a lot of demonstrated skill in these roles. And that is exciting. And I think that's the thing I've probably gotten more and more excited about, is that there's a level of not just professionalism, but oh, sorry, got muted there for a second.
Yeah, no worries.
That I think is helping out quite a bit, and so I was excited at the time. I've gotten more excited about that news since that particular moment happened.
Yeah, and he's Thad Matta has made no exception to say that he has always loved Indiana. And even there's been rumors that he's wanted to coach Indiana, and oh my, if that could have been during those troubled times, if we had Thad Matta, where would we be now? But next that kind of came up within the timeline and the scheme of things. Kenya Hunter was announced that he was going to stay on as assistant coach. Him and Cliff Marshall were kind of two that kind of stayed on as kind of transition guys to kind of keep with the players and everything, which I think obviously was very important, because it's shown and you've seen that Kenya Hunter is a very means a lot to all these players, and is someone that makes a connection to that. And speak on Kenya Hunter staying on. How did you react to that? What did you thought?
Look, Hunter, I think, is obviously a guy he brought a lot of connections with him, and has been, effective in the short time he's been at IU. And look, I think a level of continuity is always helpful, not always needed, but definitely helpful, particularly in the kind of situation that IU basketball's got, where, you've got players that are attached, not just to the head coach, but to some members of the staff. And, one of the fascinating things about Woodson's time at IU so far is him coming in and the decisions he decided to make about who was going to stay and who was going to go, and what that says, not just about his own conceptualization of basketball at this level, but also kind of just where IU is at this level, and what kind of program he wants it to be. And I think that coming in and keeping a guy like Kenya Hunter, who's had some demonstrated success on the recruiting trail, and getting him to kind of rebuy into things. Because keep in mind, Hunter had been at UConn. He wasn't an Archie guy per se. He gets brought in. I'm imagining when he sees that Archie's fired, he's just thinking, well, gosh, here we go again. I left something that looks like it's developing into a pretty good thing at UConn to come here. So,
and hadn't even been here a year.
Right. I think that I was happy that he stayed. It was more important to me that a guy who knows basketball as well as Mike Woodson does looked at Kenya Hunter and said, this is a person that we need to keep on staff. And, to me, that said a lot about Hunter's ability, because, look, I think most coaches in these circumstances are just going to say, look, I'm going to bring my own people in, and I'm going to set up my assistant room the way I want to, which is essentially, certainly what Archie did when he came in. But, so in this case, I think it says a lot that Woodson was impressed enough by Hunter's ability and his connections that he wanted him in that role. And certainly I think it provided some continuity on the recruiting trail that Woodson was going to need, because ultimately a lot of this game is just about what players you're bringing in and how they all fit together. And it's been nice to see the fruits of that kind of yield over the course of the spring and the summer and even the early fall. So I think it was a good decision all the way around.
Yeah, yeah, and well, and honestly, we should hope we get to hold on to him longer and longer because he may be our first assistant to leave as well.
Possibly. That's the
A
business, right?
head coach job may come for him very shortly. Then the next coaching kind of thing that happened was April 5th was announced that Dane Fife was coming home. Now, I was always wanting when Woodson was hired, then it was obviously who our assistant's going to be, and we were all kind of making our dream wish of who would come back and everything. And I did want a player kind of from that era. We have a lot that are assistants. Mike Lewis, who we kind of talked about possibly even coming back as head coach in that sense. So I wanted kind of him. First, sorry, Dane, if you're listening to this, you do listen to stuff and you'll give me crap for this. But I was looking for Mike at first, and then Dane was announced, and I go, yes, you know what? I like that. Because anyone that's listened to me on this show or Assembly Call knows that I want that bulldog player. That's someone that I felt has been missing from an IU team in the past couple of years. That guy that if you're playing against him, the other team can't stand that guy. That was Dane Fife. That was Dane Fife to a T. He was exactly that player. And to have him as a coach got me excited because that might bring it out of the players and everything. So what was your reaction when you heard Dane was leaving that wonderful, actually great situation he had at Michigan State and possibly a seat in waiting to come home to Indiana?
I mean, look, I thought it was a cool bit of news, and I was excited, because I do think that there have been, certain things within IU basketball that have caused the program to feel very distant from the past. And, even having like Mike Roberts on staff, while, I like Mike and I knew Mike in grad school, for a lot of IU fans, they remembered the name and a little bit of him playing, but it wasn't like, hey, we've got, a prominent former player on the coaching staff. Fife was very different from that regard. Like, here's a guy who was a name brand player for IU basketball and has been a coach that you see twice a year on the opposing sidelines, has been part of that great program at Michigan State. So, look, I thought it was awesome. And certainly I like having people from my era, finally in the realm of coaching. And
You don't feel too aged on that?
No, I don't. I'll feel aged when people like that were, students of mine are coaching IU basketball. But I think we're still another decade or so away from that, fortunately. But
Yeah.
no, it was neat to see. And I think it was an interesting move for Dane because I don't know what Dane's long-term ambitions are. I'm assuming it's to be a head coach at a place like IU or a place like Michigan State. And I think that it was time for him to move to a slightly higher echelon of things. I mean, I don't think he was the coach in waiting at Michigan State or anything like that. And I guess to me, it was another bit of validation for the Woodson project and the hire that Dolson had put together, because I think if the guy like Dane Fife, who could kind of have his pick of where to go or where to stay, decided that he wanted to come back and actively be a part of what Woodson was doing, that told me that there was something good going on behind the scenes. Because I don't think that Fife is going to leave Michigan State to go to something that has the potential to turn into a dumpster fire or anything like that. And so that was good to see. And, look, I mean, a lot of people were also interested in Lewis coming. I think that this is where it's probably some smart construction of the staff if you're Woodson, because you don't want to overload the staff with one type of person. You want to have a nice variety of coaches with a variety of backgrounds working for you. And I think Fife is very helpful as someone who is old enough to be a respected member of the coaching fraternity, who's had 20 years of experience under his belt, essentially, a little less than that, and is going to command respect from the players, but is also young enough that, he's 17, 18 years younger than Woodson is. He can act as a translator for some of the players about what Woodson is asking for and try to get it into whatever the parlance of the current generation happens to be. So it's a, good hire, right in the right age bracket, like, 40 to 45, the type of person who's got the institutional memory of IU basketball, like right at the end of the last major era, that you want to have talking to players about trying to start the next major era.
Well, you did a great transition there. Then, speaking of youth and relating to the players in the young age, then April 14th, we had the final assistant announced. Yasir Roseman was announced, and his youth and everything. Obviously, that checks off that box. We even saw that in Hoosier Hysteria, him coming out doing his little strut and everything like that, and the players were loving that, and that was tweeted out and liked by recruits and the like. And the caution, though, that came out first off with him, because his name is in some FBI stuff. And how did you react to that when you heard that hire? And did you know of him before, or did you do like a lot of us? I mean, like I do as well. I mean, I was guilty of this as well. I did not know the name. Went to Google, started to dig and search what I can, and those things came up, and you kind of have PTSD kind of situation. All these different allegations and stuff that have come around. Did that concern you at all at first, maybe? And then did you stave that back, or what was your thoughts when he was announced?
I wasn't really concerned. I mean, a lot of people were. Some people, I think, the concern was masking disappointment that somebody else wasn't named to that assistant role. And so a lot of the mock outrage or actual outrage was actually just irritation dressed up as that. But look, two things. Yeah, he was in the FBI report, but he was not playing the role of Bruce Pearl in the FBI report. Like, he wasn't Book Richardson or the Arizona staff. Like there was a definite distinction, I think. There were tiers of people who you might be concerned about. I didn't really feel like. I think a lot of the stuff in the FBI report, we could do a whole podcast about that FBI report. The sheer lack of action on that. I mean, that document's kind of become like a scarlet letter for a lot of people without a lot of actual action. And so in the world of college basketball as we know it today, I thought what was in there was relatively mild. And I think the broader point, though, for me is that if this was a different coach, different head coach, different athletic director, I might be more concerned. But I just wasn't in this case. And I feel like there's a pretty solid knowledge about, okay, within IU circles, there's a certain way that things get done. There's a certain way that you interact at the highest levels of recruiting. And I think they're hiring people with that idea in mind. And so you got Mike Woodson, who's got a very particular image of what IU basketball is. You've got Scott Dolson, who's got a very particular image of IU basketball, as they all would have signed off on this hire. I feel like I'm in a position where I can trust those folks to make the right hires. And no one in major college athletics wants to go out and put themselves in a position where they're going to be needlessly endangered by hiring somebody. And I never felt like the furor around Roseman getting hired was necessarily that deserved. So it didn't really measure with me one way or the other. I thought, okay, this sounds good. This guy sounds like an intriguing young coach. Let's just roll with it and see what happens.
Well, and then transitioning to another theme, with a coach getting fired, obviously what comes from that in an unusual situation is players are going to enter the portal, especially now with what we had in the COVID year and guys getting an exception and being able to play right away, the new portal rules and everything. And I had a fair amount of guys in there. Parker Stewart was in there, Trace Jackson Davis, Christian Lander, Jordan Geronimo, Race Thompson, Armand Franklin, Al Durham, Joey Brunk. So we had a lot of guys in there. Early on, we had a few guys that kind of announced and said that I'm staying with the program, and Trey Galloway and Anthony Leal, even before the new coach was announced. Parker Stewart was the first one to kind of announce that he was coming back on March 31st. And it's interesting. I in my mind, Trace Jackson Davis was the first, because that's kind of the story. You think he was the first, and then that kind of waterfalled everyone else. But Parker Stewart was the first one. And that date actually lines up with Kenya Hunter announcing that he was staying on. So right there, that kind of shows that, and Kenya Hunter was the one that was instrumental in getting Parker Stewart to come. So obviously there's a marriage there. And once he knew that Kenya was going to stay there, he was comfortable with staying with the program. But obviously the marquee situation of coming back was Trace Jackson Davis. And such a great story behind that too. And honestly, I felt like this whole process has changed Trace Jackson Davis in that the press conference about him coming back and anything he's done after that, he's more open. He's not shielded in the way. He's a more honest guy. He's open with himself and everything. And he said in that story that he sat down with him. He was pretty sold on it. But he wanted to have his parents in. His parents came. They talked to Coach Woodson. And then he talked to his dad for a couple minutes. And his dad basically just said, yeah, you're staying. So that kind of created the waterfall. Christian and Jordan then stay. Race announces that he's going to stay. But then we lose a few. Armand Franklin heads to Virginia. Al Durham heads to Providence. And Joey Brunk to Ohio State. So talk to me about your impressions about the portal, guys getting into it, and then just kind of how all of that fell through.
Yeah, I mean, it was always going to be interesting to see what the roster looked like. 'Cause, the one thing I didn't mention about Archie getting fired was that if there was one big underlying factor that I thought would keep him from getting fired, it was that the team was relatively young. And most of those guys were going to come back, it looked like. At least they had eligibility to come back the next year. Now, I don't know how many of them would have actually come back, because it certainly seems like the overall psychology of the program was at a pretty low ebb by the end of the season. So you could have seen all those transfers happening anyway. But I felt like, well, gosh, this roster is pretty complete. And if everybody sticks around, then the good year, the year they get back to the tournament, would probably be the next year. For Woodson to come in and have a very different style of basketball, which I think we've already seen to some degree in the Bahamas and just with the general reports of how they're going to play, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have just a like for like where players are going to want to go into that new system. And so I figured there would be some attrition. As you mentioned, I think many of the key players were, I think have stuck around, and I think that that's a good thing. As far as the guys that left, well, I mean, it's tempting to look at Al Durham leaving as like a guy in the portal leaving, but this is hard to emphasize enough to people. It's such a weird time from a roster management perspective when everybody gets an extra year that played last year. You're planning on not having Al Durham, back. You're planning on not having Joey Brunk back. And suddenly it's like, well, they're back, or are they? And so I think that there was going to be a lot of movement on that front regardless. I mean, I guess the one real surprise was Armand Franklin. But again, I think a lot of times, we try as fans to take every piece and fit them into the puzzle, even if there's only space for like 10 pieces. We try to jam all 12 or 13 pieces in. And even pieces that supposedly are good enough and like should fit in the puzzle, they just don't. And so, look, I don't know what the long-term ramifications are. Armand Franklin could turn out to be like an all-ACC guard or something like that at Virginia down the line. But I don't think there was any question that particular piece hadn't fit as well, at least offensively, as we hoped. And, Franklin might have just been looking at it and saying, I don't have as much of a guarantee with the style of play that I want here as I would have somewhere else. And so he ends up going somewhere else on that. And I'm fine with that. But I thought overall, like, to come out of the offseason with a coaching change, with the roster as relatively intact as it was, and particularly with the big piece and Trace Jackson Davis coming back, that was another illustration to me of how this experiment's got a really good chance of being successful, because there's something about it that players saw even before they stepped on the floor that made them say, I want to be a part of this. And so I'm excited about that, because anytime you can get that kind of feeling out there within the first couple of months of you getting hired, I feel like that's going to probably have a good chance of carrying over.
Yeah, and once Woodson was hired, there was obviously that list of doubts that came out, and I feel like as we went through, we started to check off those doubts, and the one doubt's, can he recruit players? And well, he proved that immediately when he recruited his own players to come back, and then also going into the portal and finding good players. We had Miller Kopp, we had Xavier Johnson, and we add Michael Durr from the transfer portal. And then the kind of big win that kind of says the recruiting thing is then we get Tamar Bates to kind of shift his commitment. It's kind of a freshman, but also kind of a transfer. It's an interesting kind of mix of a recruitment with him, and those are great pieces. And I've always thought that this team, even last year, had the right pieces to possibly succeed. There were just the wrong injuries, the wrong mindset in the sense of Rob, to kind of get past a hump. Well, then you add pieces like Miller Kopp and Xavier Johnson and Michael Durr, because how many times last year did we say if we just had Joey Brunk in there, we would have been better? And you add Michael Durr, someone that might can fill that void as he leaves. Adding those transfers, what was your reaction when all that stuff happened?
I was just really interested. I mean, it's funny, the butterfly effect. A lot of people wanted Chris Beard as head coach, and not getting Chris Beard as head coach meant we got Tamar Bates ultimately. Because, I mean, it's just like, it's funny to me how all of that stuff pieces together sometimes. But look, I mean, Bates was as good of a recruit as Archie Miller ever pulled in. And even though he doesn't technically count as a recruit, I think he does to some degree, because it's a different landscape. I mean, so much of what we think about with college basketball in particular, what we think about recruiting and pulling players in, it's really out the window at this point. I mean, with the portal, with the pandemic, with the way that players are able to move, you're reselling your program to your players every year, but you're also going out and selling players that aren't there that would be good enough that they might be able to come. And so it's I said this early on when these transfers started to happen. It's like, Woodson might be the best choice that you could make, because here's a guy who's had to deal with NBA free agency his whole career as a head coach. And the idea that you may have a player for a year and then they're gone, or you may, essentially have to trade a player for another player, and then figure out, not just how to pull those sorts of moves off, but also how to fit those players on the fly into your system. And it's really interesting watching that transpire, because I still have no clue how all of these pieces fit together. I still have no clue, like, who's starting at the guard positions. And, we feel confident Trace Jackson Davis is going to be out there, but the rest of the players, you could throw any lineup out there, picking from about 10 players, and I wouldn't be shocked. So it's hard to get your head wrapped around it, I think, from the standpoint that you look at the players that are going to be on the floor for IU, and we only know a certain amount about most of them. And, so like, we don't know that much about Bates and what he's going to look like, or Johnson and what he's going to look like, or Kopp and how he's actually going to play. And so it's a big mystery, and I can't really fully answer what I think of the transfer moves until about halfway through the season, and really see how these players bake in and work with each other. But I like what I see on the cards. I like the surface level stuff. I like the ingredients. I'm just curious to see what kind of recipe it ends up baking.
Yep. So moving on to that, then we talk about recruiting transfers and everything like that. And then we have a recruiting class that's still growing, might have one more, hopefully has one more that's going to be added. We can cross our fingers in that. But CJ Gunn obviously committed to the previous staff, and then says that he's going to stay on. We grabbed Caleb Banks, a power forward, nationally ranked 82nd. In the national rankings, and then for his position 15th. And then the big one, Jalen Hood-Schifino, we get him. He's a combo guard. He's nationally 20th in his position, 4th. And that one, with these recruits, I felt like we've kind of reached this point where it's going to be interesting to see. I feel like it's going to be a snowball effect. I think late recruits are going to be a big factor for him, because I think they're buying Woodson. They're buying the program. They're just not buying or knowing what's on the court yet. And I feel like that might be holding back some of the bigger recruits from fully committing to IU. And it's very interesting, the timing wise. Hood Schifino announces his not long after the Bahamas. So was that IU showing him some tape from the Bahamas, letting him see how he's going to play and what the team's going to be on the court, and then that was like, okay, that's enough. That's the tipping point. I'm going to IU. Could be, but shaping up to be a good class. Hopefully we can add Noah to that. But your thoughts on the recruiting class so far, and then just overall. The recruiting job that this staff is going to be able to do.
I mean, on paper, it's a really good class. And, I've become gun shy about going much further than that because, that first Archie class looked really good on paper. And, man, that did not pan out in a variety of ways. And, look, so much of the issue, I think, in the Archie era, and frankly, in the last several years of the Crean era, was pieces that didn't fit well together, or pieces that had trouble executing in game action in the same way that they executed as individuals on the AAU circuit or at the high school level. And so, look, I think all of the names so far, either the ones that are currently committed or are being talked about, do point to IU at least being a bit of a player on the national stage in terms of nabbing 4 stars and getting guys that are at a high enough base level of athleticism and execution that they'll be able to grow into really good college players. But I also really am of the mindset that, so much of IU's issues on the recruiting trail are just that it's not that special of a program to the average recruit these days. It's certainly whatever advantages IU might have had 20 years ago in terms of people wanting to go there because of past glories, that's gone. And I mean, even in the Big Ten, if you're looking at recent success, like you could make a better case for going to Ohio State or Iowa or places like that. So for IU to pull those sorts of recruits, you have to be able to sell them on a vision at this point, because that's all you've got. You start making the tournament consistently, now you can sell them on vision plus success. And so with what IU and with what Woodson has to deal with right now, I think it's a good class. It's got to be a starting point, though, because ultimately, as much as IU fans, we fall in love with every player that puts on the uniform for the most part, and we talk ourselves into them being better in many cases than they actually are. We don't tend to look at things objectively. The reality is IU has not had a sufficient number of high-level basketball players over the course of the last several years to compete at the level that the program's ambitions claim to be at. And, as much as we can criticize Archie in retrospect, the numbers of the recruits were okay there. I mean, they could have been better in certain spots, but certainly we've seen programs recruit at that level and have success, and Archie didn't. So to me, it's deeper than just the recruits or the perceived quality of them. It's also how they fit with each other and how they fit within an overall thing. And so I'm excited by what I'm seeing initially, but I'm going to take a wait and see approach until I actually see how they mesh before really being able to say a whole lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can be number one, and then it just doesn't translate. The game doesn't slow down, an injury happens, anything like that. What I do like out of the recruits that I'm seeing is the mindset. That's what you want to look at, and this staff has already talked about that you were at a disadvantage last year because they couldn't go see these guys play. You're watching these recruits in the same way that we watch them as fans on these highlights on YouTube and everything like that. And that's all good. I mean, you and I can go play a pickup game at the Y and put together a fantastic looking recruiting video for either of us. 90% of that game is not looking good, but the 10% that they cut into a video will look really good. But this staff has talked about that they go to these and they're watching their interaction on the bench. You can see how these players interact with each other, and you get more of a sense. And it sounds like that's something, obviously, a lot of coaches are going to look at, but something that's very important to this staff in particular is getting the right guys with the right attitudes and guys that are going to mesh well with this team and have that mindset. Because honestly, you can see with this team, their mind space is a lot better, and everyone has bonded in a good way, and that tone, as you can tell, because a lot of the players are the same ones, is set by the staff. And so the staff has set that, and they need to continue to build on it. We've seen that obviously in football as well. And you don't want to get the wrong recruit in that can quickly become toxic, and that can spread. So I at least like where they're headed with these guys, where their thoughts are, and who we have.
I mean, look, one thing I'll say on that, the big issue with the Archie era, I think ultimately, when people are being honest about it, is just there was a psychological weight that seemed to hang over everybody on the roster, and it mostly manifested itself on offense, where everybody looked tentative, everybody looked like they weren't sure what to do, except for Trace Jackson Davis. And, look, I mean, that will kill your ambition every year if your players aren't feeling like they should be doing what they're doing. And so I do like everything you just said. I like the change in attitude. I like this whole idea that this team likes to be around one another. Trace Jackson Davis, talked about that before. And if there is a big change in the way this team plays, I think it'll be in part because there's just a different mentality that's surrounded the program. And that might be the biggest thing that Mike Woodson ends up bringing to the table on all of this. And that is something you can recruit into, is this idea that this is a place that you want to be. It's kind of what Tom Allen's been able to do with football to a large degree. Change not just the internal attitude, but the external attitude about what being an IU football player is like. I think to a large degree, Woodson's already started to do that for IU basketball.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, the tension that transitions well. Next, we'll kind of talk about the Bahamas, and I was lucky enough to be able to go, and you saw a release of that tension, and what we saw a lot under Archie was with Rob as well. A lot of looking at the bench, a lot of looking to Archie to find out what we need to do. What do we do next? What do you want us to do? And what that breeds is that, what that means, I should say, is if you're looking back to your coach on what to do, that means when you did not look at him what to do, you were in trouble. So in the Bahamas, what quickly stemmed that was in the first game, there was an out of bounds situation underneath our basket, and Xavier Johnson looked to Woodson as to what play to call and everything. And you could hear him. I wish I knew exactly what he said, but he said something to the degree of, "You're the player, you call it, you choose, you do it." So that was an immediate weight, because that obviously shows, and what Woodson has been preaching is that free offense, that player-driven, you do what you want to do out there and everything. And a few takeaways that I had from the Bahamas was that, obviously, we got to see the free-flowing. The leadership is a lot bigger too. Trace Jackson Davis is talking a lot more. And the biggest vocal leader that we're going to see this year is going to be Miller Kopp. Miller Kopp is very vocal out there. And even in the second game, when he was injured, he was sitting on the bench. He was actually sitting behind the bench with his foot propped up. And I could still hear him yelling at the guys on the court. So he is engaged in this team, and he's excited to be there, and he's out there committed to them. Another one, again, is something that I've been preaching for forever this offseason, and last year we saw glimpses, is that Jordan Geronimo is going to be a very special player on this team. And there still has his moments. He's got a motor. He's got excitement. He's still figuring out the game. There was another moment, a coaching moment, where he just got a little too fast for his own mind or his own thoughts or what he was doing, and the ball flies out of bounds, and Woodson, in his great swagger, Cold Medina voice, just hollers out to him, relax, and everything like that. So I'm really excited for what he does this year, but also then he may become a major piece next year, with obviously a lot of roster changes and everything like that. And then additionally, maybe I'll make a poll on Twitter and see if people want to weigh in on this one. Talking with Tamar Bates, seeing him out there, seeing how exciting he is as a player and everything, the alpha that he is, the strut that he has, and he's got a jaw to him. He was jawing to those other players. He'd hit a basket and he'd talk to his defender as he was walking back to get on defense and everything like that. So an interesting poll I might come out, and let me have you weigh on this. I was talking to Jeff Rabjohns and Eric from Hoosier Hysterics about this, and we kind of made a little prop bet for the year. How many technicals we think Tamar's going to get for taunting? I think we set the over/under at 2.5. So whether you think he's going to get 2 or more than 2, what do you think? What do you think of that? And then just speak of what you saw or heard in the Bahamas.
Well, I mean, to answer the poll question first, I'll take the over, not because I think that that he's necessarily going to be pushing the issue on that, but anytime you have a slight rules change or anything where we start emphasizing something, officials go nuts on it because they want to demonstrate that they can call that. And then now it becomes, there's like this undercurrent in college sports right now of like, showing these college kids who's boss and like that there's still an authority structure, whether you're an official or a coach or whatever. So yeah, I'll take the over on that. I mean, look, the Bahamas thing is interesting. I was upset I didn't get a chance to go in person, but I got a chance to watch some footage. I mean, I certainly think that there's enough there that you could look at it and say this team is of a different mindset than they were before. And there are certainly going to be some personalities and some talent emerging on this roster that just, they haven't been front and center. And to some degree, it's funny. I think that the last few years, really, you might say the entire Archie era, it felt like we were waiting for somebody to step up and take center stage on the floor rather than just being this expression of what Archie's personality was. And Archie's personality was pretty boring. It was pretty cardboard. It was like there wasn't a lot of there weren't many jagged edges there, and there wasn't a lot for fans to grab onto. And so, from a personality perspective, I think having players who can play with decisiveness and make their own decisions and aren't constantly looking to the bench for resolution, but also players who exhibit personality. I mean, the one guy who was reliable at doing that was Devontae Green during Archie's tenure, and that was a pretty combustible situation, all told. Like that was, It was like, well, we want to see more of this, but maybe not like that.
Yeah,
that was kind of the mentality I think a lot of IU fans had, and so. I think that I guess it goes back to what I said earlier. It's hard for me to know how that's going to manifest this year and what from the Bahamas actually translates into what we see in November and December and beyond. Because it's just, I've almost become so hypnotized by the lack of distinctiveness from IU basketball for the last several years that it's hard to envision a self-actualized roster, a group of people who really just go out and have a solid sense of self and a solid team identity, and who go out and impose their will, as opposed to a group that's reacting to what the other teams are doing. And I think it doesn't mean that you can't win in those circumstances. I mean, IU, they swept Iowa last year, and they racked up wins against Michigan State during Archie's tenure. Like, you could beat really good teams like that, but it always felt like IU was, employing countermeasures rather than going out and imposing what they wanted to do. And especially offensively, I never really knew what Indiana wanted to do. And I don't think it's going to be one of those things where you snap your fingers and suddenly this is a team that looks like a Michigan or looks like a Duke or a North Carolina. But I do think that they're starting to get down that path once again. And that's going to be the big test for Mike Woodson and the players that are there. Can you forge an identity that you can live off of game after game, week after week throughout the course of a season? And so I'm excited about what I've seen to start with, but it's like I do have some concerns. And it's like, Miller Kopp being like the vocal leader. and a guy that IU is going to rely on consistently. I think it's cool. I love his presence on social media, but I look at him as a player and I say, as many minutes as he played last year, didn't score very much, or didn't score very efficiently, shall we put it that way. I mean, under 1 point per possession. Yes, he's playing at Northwestern, which that's like you're paying a tax on your offense. Floor there, I get that. But as with many other things with this team, I guess maybe I'm guarding my heart slightly and not allowing a couple of games in the Bahamas or what people are saying in press conferences to get me overly excited until I actually see it. Once I see it, boom, count me in. But I need to kind of get to that point first.
Yeah. Well, you bring up an interesting thing maybe we'll touch on here briefly as well as Miller Kopp doing his videos and everything like that. We've obviously had NIL, which is a totally different thing. We could get on that and be on that for forever. But this coaching staff seems to be more available, more open to the media, more honest. He doesn't shy away from it. Archie, you could always tell, just wanted to do the bare minimum and get out of there. Well, this staff is a lot more active on social media. You have Dane Fife, as I said, firing back at everyone, even in his first kind of presser, was calling out the media and everything. And then I don't know if it's the coaching staff breeding that mentality or NIL coming out. We're seeing a lot more interaction with the players as well. Bahamas happens as well, and I urge anyone that can have the means to try to go to one of these things, because you have a lot of access to the players and coaches at these as well, and they seem to be more open to talk to fans and interact in the different media outlets for things. Do you think that's NIL? Do you think that's the new staff? Do you think we're in a good mixture? Is that just the world we're becoming right now?
Well, gosh, that has a lot to unpack there. So,
yeah.
I think this coaching staff is far more comfortable with the public aspects of being in charge of IU basketball than either of the previous, well, really any of the staffs going back to when Bob Knight was fired. I've often said that being the head coach of IU basketball is kind of like being a religious figure. You are essentially the pope of a large diaspora of people who will buy into you in a heartbeat, but you have to give them something in return. And, it's one of the reasons why Bob Knight was always so successful, is that he very well understood that he was a basketball coach and he had no problem putting fans in their place collectively and say, look, I'm coaching the team. I understand what I'm doing. Even if you don't like the results right now, this is the direction we're going because I know that much about the game. And I've always felt like whether it was Mike Davis or Kelvin Sampson or Tom Crean or Archie Miller, there was something that held them back from doing that. And I think it's different for everybody. I think Davis is just kind of, he wasn't ready psychologically for that weight. Few are. Sampson was ready for it, but also didn't really fully grasp how to harness IU fans and get them behind him. And then, of course, things fell apart very quickly during that process. Crean, I think, actually did a good job at first and then gradually got more and more insulated in his own cocoon, I guess. And then Archie, I think you kind of summed it up. Like, Archie just wanted to coach basketball. And you could do that at a place like Dayton, where you win games, you get to the tournament regularly, you're a god there. That's not enough at IU. Like and especially if the wins aren't there, if you're not getting to the tournament, people are going to take your lack of love for talking to fans and interacting with the media as just being aloof. And that's the kiss of death in that circumstance. So I think whether it's Woodson or whether it's Dane Fife or whether it's Kenya Hunter, I think these guys are all naturally more comfortable in their own skin, more comfortable with the public-facing aspects of the job. And it's interesting, like, watching that plug into the NIL situation and players being more empowered to go out and speak their minds, go do autographs, get paid to appear on podcasts. I'm surprised you started with me. You could have easily just dropped $20 for somebody. They probably would have come on, maybe not at 8 a.m. on a Sunday, but I do think that you have to have coaches now who are self-confident enough that when their players go out and talk, they're not threatened by it, or they don't feel like that's negatively imposing something on their program. I mean, there was that thing that happened yesterday where Oklahoma comes back and wins over Texas in the Red River Shootout, and Lincoln Riley won't let his young quarterback go talk to the media. And that's a common thing where freshmen aren't allowed to talk to the media, and it's like, guys, that era is past. Like, it really is. Like, the idea that we're not going to let freshmen talk, we're not going to let younger players talk, that's a relic from 20 years ago that I think is going to go away pretty quickly, because it's a different time. And so I'm excited about the fact that this coaching staff is comfortable talking to fans, is comfortable just saying what they want to say and being honest with their answers, and seems to be confident and comfortable with players doing the same thing. I think that's going to end up equating to something positive down the road. Great.
All right, well, we'll start to wrap it up with kind of final thought question that I had. So if you were able to have a conversation with Doc back after that final game, and you told him on March 11th, after that Rutgers loss, where we are right now, how would you react? Do you think you'd be floored? You'd be amazed? Would you blow your own mind?
Well, okay. Can you ask me this again in a couple of months? Because I keep coming back to this. I think with the benefit of hindsight, with the money not being an object, it was the right time to make a move. I think that the offseason's been very good, probably better than I thought it would have been if the scenario had been laid out before it happened. I don't know that I'm at a point yet where I would be blown away, just simply because not a lot has actually happened yet. A lot's happened on paper. Not a lot has happened outside of that. And I think the one thing I've tried to do with IU basketball over the course of the last few years is remind myself that the results are what matter. The on-court results are what matter. And so I am more excited about the future and the direction of IU basketball now than I was 6 months ago, or 8 months. I guess it would have been 8 months ago. And I'm trying to hang on to that. I think that that's where I want to be. I don't want to get any more down the road on that front, because I've done that before and I've gotten disappointed. And so I like all of the ingredients that are on the counter right now, but to continue the food metaphor, I need to see a couple of dishes get made first. And once I get to that point, then maybe my mind will indeed be blown. But I think it's about as good as you would have expected it to be at this particular point in time. And I'm satisfied with that for now. And we'll just have to check back in a couple of months and see where we're at with things.
All right. Well, keeping your food metaphor going, I'm full of Kool-Aid. My bladder's going to explode. I'm all in. I think Bahamas is kind of what was the tipping point for me, to be able to at least see something and everything, and be there in person for the excitement. I'm trying to, like I said at the beginning, keep that just excitement and optimism in the same wheelhouse. Not look at expectations, but just be excited. Needless to say, one way or the other, we're going to see a lot different IU basketball on the court. We're going to see a very different team. We're going to see an exciting team. Who knows what kind of wins and losses that creates. There's plenty of things out there right now, forecasting things. You never know what things are going to happen. But, we'll just have to see when we get out there. So thanks, Galen, for coming on. Guys, that's going to do it for this edition of Hoosier Morning After. Please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow me on Twitter at General Chadwick. There you can find out information about the show and even ask questions that we'll try to answer on the show. Special thanks again, Galen Clavio, for being on today. You can follow him at Twitter at Dr. GC, and find all the wonderful Crimson casts that he does out there. Special shout out to Bob Thompson for producing the music that you hear on the show. Hoosier Morning After will be back exactly 1 month from today, with the first post-game show after Indiana takes on Eastern Michigan. Until then, guys, go out there and have a wonderful day. And as always, go Hoosiers.